Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Betty Chen. The December 2023 China-EU summit in Beijing marked the first in-person meeting in 4 years due to the pandemic. EU member states, including France, Germany, Greece, and Hungary, aimed to strengthen ties with China through state visits, economic cooperation, and cultural exchanges. Amid ongoing trade tensions, the EU sought to redefine its China strategy and discuss the Taiwan Strait issue. What other key topics were addressed at the summit? Joining us today are Marcin Jerzewski, European Value Centers for Security Policy Taiwan Office Head, and Charles Wu, National Chengchi University Department of Diplomacy Professor and Chair. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show. So, Marcin, the EU's top priority at this moment is the significant trade imbalance with China. China has amassed a nearly 400 billion euros surplus in its trade over the past 2 years, with no concrete solutions proposed. And this will definitely see the lack of understanding between the two sides. Could you please tell us a bit more about the EU industries? Which industries have heavily relied on China, and how might the EU address the policy towards China?
Definitely. The European Union has considerable trade deficits with China in energy, chemicals, and machinery and vehicles. But particularly when we look at green technologies, which are necessary for the European Union to achieve its net zero objectives, we can see that the dependency on China is truly staggering. The European Union relies on China for over 4/5 of its solar panel needs and over 90% of its needs for battery-grade lithium and rare earth permanent magnets, both key components for the manufacturing of electric vehicles. This is the reason why it's particularly important for the European Union to learn lessons from players such as Japan, which have successfully decreased their reliance on China when it comes to these critical technologies necessary to mitigate climate change. I believe that initiatives such as the new Net Zero Industries Act with reliancy clauses embedded into the document might be helpful in decreasing the reliance of the EU on China. However, an all-out effort, not only by the European Union institutions, but also by the private sector is needed to really make it a reality.
You talk about important industries, like especially when it comes to net zero and also green energy transition. So what's your take on this, Charles? Do you think that, Marcin mentioned Japan has been a good example for the EU. Do you think that they can really follow the footsteps of Japan, like really reduce their reliance on China?
We know that the trade deficit between China and EU is significant. And they try to kind of, we say, de-link or decouples in order to maintain their kind of, at least reverse the significance of the trade deficit. However, we know that if you want to reverse the trade deficit, you cannot de-link or decouple. You still need to build up the economic relations in order to kind of reverse the deficit. This happened in the trade war between Trump and China. When Trump initiated the trade war against China, he wanted to win back all the deficit. Okay, so this is one thing. This is how EU right now they need to think about how to reduce the dependence on those we call sustainable components, this kind of rare earth or very critical minerals. How to kind of split the dependence on China and find out a new market. I think this is a very important thing we need to observe.
So indeed, you talk about the importance, say, rare earth or key materials, and also you talk about de-risking and decoupling, and that was also something mentioned in the summit. And the example of graphite is a very good one. For example, this is a very essential material to the defense industry, and exports of graphite have been limited by China, thereby creating a risk for Europe. However, there seems to be no signs of compromise from China. Could that indicate that EU-China relations are heading towards to an impasse after the summit? Marcin.
I think that to some extent we can argue that China-EU relations are already at an impasse. So it is promising that both sides still show signs that they are willing to engage, and I think that holding the summit in person and having high-level representation of both sides is a success in and of itself, considering that EU-China relations are truly in a nadir. If we take a look at some of events which took place this year, it becomes quite evident that the relations are now subject to heightened tensions. In October, the European Commission launched an investigation into subsidies for electric vehicles manufactured in China. Graphite is not the only critical material whose exports were limited by China. Earlier in the year, in August, China imposed restrictions on exports of germanium, for instance, which is a critical material for the manufacturing of semiconductors. Exactly. The relations between both sides are already very difficult, and I believe that while engagements and high-level dialogues will remain in place, it's worth mentioning that at the summit it was announced that the high-level people-to-people dialogue is going to be reinstated. Relations between both sides will remain tense.
So, Marcin, you talk about these economic aspects. And Charles, how do you think that this kind of economic strain between China and EU impacting its, say, political or diplomatic relationship between the two sides?
Yes, let me add out one thing about the economic relation between China and EU. Last year, about 440,000 Chinese cars sold to EU. It's huge numbers. One of them is BYD. BYD is a very strong electric cars brand made by China. It created huge impacts on the EU's vehicle markets. But we need to know that this kind of economic tensions or deficit between EU and China will lead us to think about whether it will spill over to what we call political or diplomatic arenas. For example, if EU want to win back the trade deficit, they will put what we call the subsidies or the trade barriers. And this will create ex-China to do the same thing, we call tit for tat. So when China responds with tit for tat, the economic battles between these two entities will create some impacts on their trade relations, first thing. Second thing, the economic tensions between these two entities will also spill over to what we call the multilateral cooperations. For example, worse and worse economic relations will make the two sides on several other cooperation. For example, public health issues, green energy issues, or we call the global climate change issues. So I'm afraid of this kind of spillover effects from the economic battles will let the two economic giants fighting and arguing in other fields. The third thing is human rights. Human rights is a very important topic within the EU areas. And if the economic tensions getting higher and higher, probably EU will try to pay more attention on the human rights situation in China and put more criticism on that. So all in all, I think in the future, the two sides need to settle down, how they figure out the economic tensions, try to focus on economic arenas instead of bring other things into this kind of called giant trash holes.
So you talk about a trash hole and also all the strained relations economically. But just recently, China has announced to grant visa-free entry to some EU countries. Do you think that this is a way for China to extend an olive branch to Europe? What's your take on this? Will this help with the tension between the two sides?
I think this is always good. I mean, after China settled down the US-China, big framework of the cooperation. Next one is they try to settle down the different, we call the sub-framework. For example, the Sino-European, Sino-Korea, and Japan. Who sent out the first olive branch is very important because if you always have a very tough or hardcore standpoints, it's not easy for them to start to cooperations. If you use the tit for tat, the first side is you need to give the olive branch first, and then people will respond the cooperative strategies. So I think China give the visa free to several countries in European Union. I think it's a good sign in order to try to speed up the cooperation between China and EU. However, like I said, they still need to go back to hardcore of economic issues, how to solve the economic tensions, try to reduce the deficits. It's a very important thing. But I know Chinese people, they are good at doing business. So European Union, they need to think about how to do a good business with Chinese people.
What's your take on this, Marcin?
One concern that I have about China's unilateral decision to grant visa-free access to citizens of certain member states is that it might be read as a continuation of China's divide and conquer efforts vis-à-vis the European Union. It should be borne in mind that the opening of visa-free access to China was not granted to citizens of all Schengen area states.
Only a few, right?
Five.
Only five.
And when we look at the trajectory of engagements between China and Europe, we see initiatives such as the China Central Eastern Europe Cooperation Framework, formerly known as the 17-16 and eventually 14+1 initiative, which sought to draw divisions between member states for the benefit of China and to ease China's access to European institutions. Therefore, I think that the move was very self-interested, and I would read it not so much as an olive branch, but rather an effort by the Chinese state to reach out to some of the top-performing economies in the European Union, while China is suffering from declining FDI rates. China is really suffering from low levels of foreign investment in the country, and that move, which will definitely stimulate people-to-people interactions, might be a way to put China back on the mental map of potential lucrative investment destinations for investors from these select 5 countries.
So we talk about the important reliance from EU on China for certain important materials, but how can Europe reduce its reliance on China and look for alternative source for these key materials, maybe South America or other places? Any suggestions?
I would say that an essential tool to achieve supply chain resiliency, which is at the very core of the European Union's de-risking efforts, is diversification through free trade agreements and also sectoral partnerships in areas such as critical raw materials. The European Union has a lot of potential in accelerating the negotiations on free trade agreements with players such as Australia, India, Indonesia, Thailand, and also updating its existing agreements with partners such as Chile and Mexico, which will increasingly play an important role in the global supply chains for critical raw materials. And I believe that as a normative power, the European Union also has the potential to make mining operations in these countries, in Chile and in Mexico, more sustainable than operations carried out by China. So it is important that the European Union is not only an extractor, that it not only carries out mining operations in those countries, but also develops local supply chains which are compliant with its environmental and labor standards.
What's your take on this, Charles?
Yeah, the EU they try to make some, the laws or act in order to encourage member states to extract or get this kind of raw materials, reduce the dependence on other countries. In 2023 March, they published a law, Critical Raw Material Act, which within this law, they say in certain kind of industry, for example, the green industry, digital industry, defense industry, they encourage the industries to extract or process the minerals, for example, lithiums or nickels within the EU instead of depending on the third parties. So I think this is a very important kind of legal aspect we need to study, how they use these kind of norms or normative issues, try to push the member state within the EU to get the critical minerals by themselves instead of heavily reliance on the China.
So historically, China has sought to drive a wedge between Europe and the United States, actively promoting the concept of strategic autonomy for Europe to lessen its dependence on the United States. How much strategic importance does Europe's economic and political standing hold for China today? Marcin.
I believe that the European Union will remain consistent in applying its triptych approach to China. So China is perceived by Brussels simultaneously as a partner, rival, and competitor. And I believe that this is here to stay. One feature of foreign and security policy making in the European Union is that it is driven by the principle of consensus and requires the consent of all 27 member states. Therefore, as the European Union continues to figure out how to approach China, it will very possibly face a contradiction of two forces. One force being the European Commission and the other one being the European Council, which represents the heads of member states. So heads of states and heads of governments of member states. So the European Commission, under the leadership of Ursula von der Leyen, is likely to continue down the path of de-risking, trying to protect supply chains from excessive dependence on China. However, we might hear opposition from certain member states that might be worried of potential economic backlash from China, and that includes countries like Germany and Spain, or which are closer politically aligned with the authorities in Beijing, such as Hungary.
Charles?
I think this is very important for Chinese government when they're trying to build up their grand strategies. Now they're facing the United States-led, we call the pivot to Asia, or Indo-Pacific strategies, which building a block on their right-hand side. So they think about moving toward the, we call the west side to European unions. How to build a more closer, tighter political ties and also economic ties. I think it's very important for China's grand strategy. This is why they want to use this kind of strategy combining with BRIs. Try to build this kind of economic and political ties between EU and China. We look at the Chinese railroad, 中欧班列, the China-European Railroad Express, is a very important, we call it the economic tube, economic vibe for them to how to build a very close tie between European Union and China. This is how China wants to sustain their economic developments, especially we see European is their first trade partner of China. Also, China is also a very important partner of European unions. So how these two big entities maintain a sustainable economic cooperations is a very important thing for us to observe.
So you talk about the relationship between China and Europe, just like what Marcin said, it's like a partnership and but also like rival and also competitor. After President Biden's recent meeting with Xi Jinping at the APEC, there's an ongoing effort to mend U.S.-China relations. The China-Europe Summit also aims to improve ties with China. So what's the significance of China's role to Europe and to the United States?
This is interesting. 4 years ago, when European Union they published the strategic papers, they mentioned China-EU is we call it holy trinity, right? You read this one. It's a partner, competitor, and also systemic rivals. These three combined together give us a lot of questions. How can you view each other as a partner, competitor, and systemic rivals? So I studied hedging, which means country will not put all eggs in one basket. So far, I know European Union, when they mention this called Holy Trinity, they're also doing the same thing. They try to de-risk, which means they are risk-averse entities. They don't want to put all the eggs in one basket. They know China is a big market, the very important trade partner. However, China also creates some threats or creates some kind of dangers for their political survival for European countries. So how to balance between a partner, competitor, and rivals is, I think, von der Leyen she's trying to do. I think she's doing quite well. The balance between the friend and voice. However, Chinese people, they're also very smart. They know you are using hedging, and right now they don't want you to have giving them some commitments. They say doing business is very important. Let's keep our business in business. So, like I say, how to build a sustainable and meaningful bilateral economic relationship is very important for European Union and China.
So Charles talked about a holy trinity and you talk about different relationships. What's your take on this from an EU perspective?
I believe that this holy trinity or the triptych in the European Union's approach to China is a necessary product of this consensus-based rulemaking that I mentioned earlier. So in order to reconcile the truly divergent approaches of 27 member states vis-à-vis China, the European Union needed to include these divergent angles in its approach to China under the common foreign and security policy. At the same time, I think that the European Union will continue to struggle with its internal divisions over the question of how to handle China. We can see that countries in Central and Eastern Europe, including Lithuania and other Baltic states and the Czech Republic, have taken a more assertive stance towards China as at national level they develop rule-based or norm-based foreign policies, while other countries remain quite closely aligned with China, and that includes that includes Hungary, very potentially it might also include Slovakia after its most recent elections.
So I also have another question, but that is not related to United States, but it's related to Russia. So at the China-Europe summit, European leaders made it clear that they hope Xi Jinping will leverage China's economic influence over Russia to encourage a ceasefire and a withdrawal of Russian forces. How do you analyze China's official claim of neutrality, especially in light of Xi Jinping's consistent denial of favoring Russia? Marcin.
I think we should make it crystal clear that the question of China's support for Russia during its full-scale invasion in Ukraine was one of the two most important items for the European Union for this summit, along with structural trade imbalances that we have already discussed at length. And even though the People's Republic of China has not yet crossed the Western world's red line of providing lethal technologies to China, there is quite a lot of evidence of China providing dual-use technologies, so militarily useful hardware that facilitates Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. And in September, the European Union envoy for sanctions, David O'Sullivan, has claimed that over 70% of high tech, which is killing Ukrainians, came into Russian hands through China. So the European Union recognizes the ongoing war in Ukraine as one of the greatest challenges to the safety and stability of the European Union and the European continent more broadly. It is reflected very clearly in the 2022 strategic compass of the European Union, which recognizes Russia as a prominent source of threats, and therefore, despite the no-limits partnership between Beijing and Moscow, Brussels is seeking to call on China to use its special role as a veto-holding power in the UN Security Council to hold the atrocities.
So Charles, how do you see Russia's role in Europe's interest?
Russia's invasion in Ukraine created certain impacts, especially the political survival, country survival for a lot of European countries, Poland and some small countries nearby. They worry about that. They worry probably Putin's ambitions is not only for Ukraine. So this is, we need to go back to realist ideas, because when we pay too much about normative issues, norms, rules, sometimes it becomes so, not very flexible. When we go back to realist powers and power and national capabilities, they will create some deterrence against Russians' ambitions or the expansions. So like I say, now it's time for the European Unions, or even we call NATO, different. Think about whether the appeasement policy still should be considered, or they need to do another way to kind of deter Putin's ambitions.
So now let's switch gear. Actually, the issue of Taiwan Strait was also mentioned in a summit. So what's your take on the China-EU summit stance on Taiwan Strait issue?
I mean, Taiwan, we used to be a good friend of the European Union. However, we cannot really get into their influences. We have only one allies, which is Vatican. Now we are building our very close relation with, for example, Lithuania, and also we create this kind of called diplomatic allies, try to use our values, share values, soft powers, democracies. We will try very hard to get into European Union. However, this is one thing, because the EU's their policies or strategy on Indo-Pacific is under the US-China framework, which means when if Washington don't change their one China policy, EU will not change. So every time we say, we can observe that EU always say we follow the one China policy, and they reveal, we call it strategic ambiguity, which means they say we don't want to see the unilateral attack from Beijing, and they don't support Taiwanese independence. So this kind of framework is under we call Washington, Beijing's strategic framework. It's very hard to them to revise by EU themselves. They always listen to United States security strategies. But like I say, Taiwan will try very hard. We want to build our relation with a lot of countries in the world, bilateral, multilaterals, using democracy as a very important mechanism.
So, Marcin, what's your take on Taiwan's geopolitical stance and how it plays out between the situation between Europe and China?
I think that the stance of the European Union on Taiwan is very clear. The European Union, in all of its engagements with Taiwan, is guided by its One China policy. And essentially, during the summit, the representatives of the European Union reiterated that the EU opposes any unilateral changes in the Taiwan Strait. To the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, and that will remain the guiding principle of engagements with Taiwan. However, what the European Union can do as it seeks to bolster its economic, scientific, people-to-people, cultural, and to some extent political ties with Taiwan is to discover the flexibility embedded in its own formulation of One China policy. So even though Taiwan, according to the European Union, should not go as far as to declare formal independence, it remains an important democratic, like-minded partner of the European Union, and there is space for this European Commission and also for the new European Commission, which will be established after next year's elections, to discover these spaces for greater engagement with Taiwan.
Do you think that position will remain unchanged for the EU despite the change in the leadership?
I think so. The European Union has relied on its formulation of One China policy in its engagements with Taiwan for a very considerable amount of time, and I don't think that there is any political will in Brussels or in member states to diverge from that approach.
Definitely hope a BIA between Taiwan and the EU will be signed in the near future. If you like our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.